far left running wild once again. That is the subject of this evening's Talking Points memo. If the Tea Party has interrupted anyone's speech lately, shouting down a liberal person, for example, I have not heard about it. If college students are being indoctrinated and intimidated by conservative professors, I have not heard about it. But on the other side, the far left is becoming increasingly bold and fresh in trying to silence those with whom they disagree. One of the consequences of having a liberal president twice elected is that the fringe left feels emboldened and thinks it can do whatever it wants. At the University of Southern California, for example, Dari Sprago, who teaches political science, has turned his classroom into an anti-Republican stronghold.
Republican Party California, as I say all the time, on the record, in print, and on radio and on TV, is the last vestige of any real white people, and that's what this is. Republicans are trying to prevent people of color and people of lower income from voting by requiring voter ID. We discovered, and this is generally true, the least flexible voter in America, the person who's less likely to change their mind about anything, is an old white guy. Old white guys are stubborn sons of bitches. They just are.
Education at its best, wouldn't you say? The tuition at USC, more than $45,000 a year. A couple of days ago, at the University of Massachusetts, Karl Rove was insulted. Yesterday at Howard University, Senator Rand Paul was insulted.
Republicans still prize the sense of justice that MLK spoke of when he said that an unjust law is any law that a majority enforces on a minority but does not make binding upon itself.
The trend is undeniable. The far left intruding on the national discourse, perverting the educational system, and generally behaving as badly as any movement has since the late 1960s. Fair-minded Americans will eventually reject this explosion of zealotry, as they always have. But in the meantime, students and others are getting hurt, a disturbing trend that must be confronted. And that's the memo. Now for the top story tonight, reaction. Join us from Washington, Charles Krauthammer. Now, I see this intrusion as a growing problem. It's getting worse. Do you agree?
I'm not sure I think so, and I do go back to the 1960s, when instead of a fringe protest here and there, these radicals took over the universities, they occupied them, they dictated policy, the administrations caved in, the police stayed out, and then they did even something more effective. They realized, well, you know, coming in from the outside is really not going to do much. You get a little attention, publicity. What the left decided late in the 60s, early 70s, was what Lenin and other Marxists have prescribed, what's called the march through the institutions. They got inside. They did it legally. They did it the right way. They got their PhDs. They got appointments. They got tenure. They kept out conservatives. That's why you have a lot of conservative think tanks. A think tank is essentially a university without students, and it's one that is not run by liberals, because a lot of conservatives are denied tenure and appointments, and they basically control overwhelmingly the elite universities. I'm not worried about these elements who do the interruption. I think they're rude, they're unmannered, but they're also fringe and they're infantile. They really have no effect on the national discourse. The people who do have an effect on national discourse are people of the left who do it the right way. They either, over a generation, take over the universities, or by working very hard in politics, win election after election.
All right, but if you're looking at a democracy, a vibrant democracy, you've got to have respect for opposing points of view. And right now, at the college university system, there is no respect for opposing points of view. I mean, USC is a huge school. This guy's ramming this stuff down the student's throat. That video was shot by a conservative student who had had enough and had gone to the administration at USC, and they said, hey, get out of here, you know, and he documented it and then put it out to the media. So I'm seeing that this is a big threat to our democracy here. Because if you have an indoctrination at the major universities across the country, which you do, then you're going to have an electorate that you can see changing and moving to the left, basically because of the education system.
Well, two things. First of all, that professor, it's rather comical. He doesn't have a sense of irony of realizing that he is precisely the kind of old white guy who he says is stubborn, unthinking, and dumb. And of course he is. He hasn't had a new thought, obviously, since he was an undergraduate. What I think is more important is the fact that we have had the left dominating the universities and the media and Hollywood and the foundations, all of these cultural institutions, for at least a generation, up to 30, 40 years. And, you know, at the beginning of that time, the 60s, well, let's say the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s, Republicans and conservatives did very well. In fact, right up to Obama in 2008. Since from Nixon to Obama, the Republicans controlled national government far more than did the Democrats. I think what disturbs me is less the intolerance and the lack of respect, which I think is very important, coming out of these hecklers, but the leadership, the lack of it, that comes from the president.
I got one more question. Why don't we see this on the right? Why don't we see conservative people, because certainly there are zealots on the right, fanatics on the right, but we don't see them going into the colleges and shouting down people, and the few conservative professors, we don't see them indoctrinating. Why not?
Look, since time immemorial, young people tend to be far more liberal than conservative. The old adage from Churchill and others, if you're not a socialist when you're 20, you don't have a heart. If you're not a conservative when you're 50, you don't have a head. And these are fringe, infantile, silly people who have no influence, no power, and they know it. And the only way they'll get any attention...
But aren't there silly people on the right, young silly people who would do that?
I think the young are far more liberal than conservative.
I know,
I think that's
but
why the numbers are this way.
You don't see that kind of behavior. It's interesting.